Good morning and good evening to you all, wherever you're joining in from the world. I firstly hope that you are all staying safe and healthy. Welcome to the 15th episode of the Voices of Sustainability virtual fireside chat series. My name is Toby Thorpe. I'm a graduate of Huonville High School, the 2017 Global High Schools winner of the Zayed Sustainability Prize for the Oceania region, and proud youth, climate and community advocate who's been working for almost 10 years in supporting young people to unlock solutions to the world's biggest problems. The Zayed Sustainability Prize was established in 2008 as the United Arab Emirates Pioneering Global Award for recognizing organizations and global high schools for their sustainable, innovative, and humanitarian solutions. Today, the prize counts 14 years of global impact, with 370 million people around the world benefiting from its winners' solutions across the categories of health, food, energy, water, and global high schools. In today's episode, we will delve into the topic of youth at the wheel. But first, I'd like to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Andreas Jacobs is an independent entrepreneur and key shareholder in several companies across the globe. He serves as chairman of INSEAD and is a member of the Zayed Sustainability Prize jury. Dr. Bisher Imam is the officer in charge at the UNESCO Regional Bureau for Sciences in the Arab States, authored over 60 peer-reviewed publications on topics related to water. Jesse Forrester is the founder and CEO of Mazu Mobility. Jesse was a team leader at the African Leadership Academy in South Africa that won the 2019 Zayed Sustainability Prize under the Sub-Saharan African region. We have Hayley Payne, who is a youth advisor at the Global Centre on Adaptation and a volunteer officer at the Australian Red Cross. And Aisha Sarah Ahmed, a student at Hira School in the Maldives that won the 2022 Zayed Sustainability Prize under the South Asia region. Today, we're having this conversation on the occasion of International Youth Day, which we marked tomorrow. And through this year's theme of intergenerational solidarity, creating a world for all ages, we are amplifying the message that action is needed across all generations to achieve the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and leave no one behind. Unfortunately, there are some barriers to intergenerational solidarity, notably ageism, which impacts young and old people while having detrimental effects on society and on our planet. Fostering intergenerational solidarity is necessary to ensure an inclusive and sustainable recovery. As we navigate the third year of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is especially important to recognise and address these age-related barriers to build back better in a manner that leverages all generations' strengths and knowledge. So how do we overcome these challenges and engage all voices, both young and old, to find successful pathways to respond to climate change and move the green transition forward is the focus of today's episode. And we have an incredible group of guest speakers that I'd really love to introduce to you all with our first question in today's session. Andreas, ageism presents a significant challenge to fostering collaboration and solidarity across age groups. The World Health Organization defines ageism as the stereotypes, how we think, prejudice, how we feel, and discrimination in how we act, directed towards others or oneself based on age. And ageism can prevent people from reaching their full potential and contribute to their community. In your opinion, what are some of the age-related stereotypes leveled against young people that older generations should try to address to ensure youth are treated as equal and important partners in driving the energy transition?
Well, very complex question. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think there's two questions. One is about ageism, and one is about how to foster generations to help driving the energy transition. So let me start with the first one, which is solidarity, ageism. It's all about inclusion, exclusion and inclusion of all generations. By the way, also older generations. I'm getting there. You can see it here. So it's about inclusion of generations. And that's very different in different continents. I'm living in the Western world. My heart is very much in Africa, and I worry and I concern about the African inclusion of the young generation. As you said, there's lots of stereotypes. Let me not repeat all these stereotypes. You can see them on the internet, but it's all about excluding the young. It's about being biased. It's about eldertism. It's about the fear of the older to be replaced by the young, to be retired, to be diminished. It's about the older to pity, to marginalize, to patronize the young, which means you think they're nice, but they're incompetent. And that's one of the stereotypes, which I think are terrible for society, but terrible for inclusion. They're not good for health. They're not good for maturing. They're not mentally and physically good. It's discriminating, and we all know this. And that's why I think we're addressing this today on that special day for the youth. Let's discuss that later on how we can empower the youth to enforce further energy transition. And I'd like to expand that to ESG transition. But back to you.
Thank you for that. And Jesse and Hayley, I'd love to throw to you, in your opinion as young people, what are the barriers as young people standing in the way to today that prevent young people from being able to contribute as equal partners with adults in driving climate action? And how do you think young people work to overcome these barriers? Hayley, would you like to start there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Toby. I think young people are living with multiple barriers, really, in trying to take climate action. Across the Asia Pacific, we have populations of countries where young people make up to 60% of the population in some circumstances, but still they don't have a position at the decision-making tables. And a lot of these barriers are simply down to surviving daily life. Young people are living in countries of conflict. They're the people that are most affected by conflict. They're living in changing climates and simply trying to get along in a world where there's rising poverty, growing inequality, and so many other social and economic and political factors that are really keeping them at bay from being able to truly meaningfully engage. And I think there's two layers to this. There's not only the side of youth being able to overcome those barriers by stepping up and taking on political interest when they can, getting involved with collaborating with other young people and pushing for community and global projects. But there's also really another and equally as important side to this, that we really need decision makers to start actively working to engage young people and seeing young people as individuals and as experts, and not just as tokenistic inclusions on boards and in other areas as well. And I think that's something that we really need to think about this International Youth Day, where we're looking at intergenerational dialogue and how we can kind of work to overcome these things. But yeah, I'll let Jesse jump in there as well.
No, well said, Hayley, well said. And I think as most of it really rests in the fact that young people are not taken seriously. And I think that, I run a mobility company. I'm one of the youngest CEOs in my industry. I am the youngest CEO in my industry. And still sometimes when speaking, fortunately I look old, right? But when people find out my age, it's really a shift in how they interact with me, in how they treat me. And it's unfortunate because previously, we were speaking at such a level ground, or maybe we respected my opinion, but then that changes. And the value of seeing young people as you said, experts and people who really can lead and spearhead change, because it is the world we now have that we've borrowed from an abundance of funding in terms of supporting youth activities in this space. I think is going to be key. And then pairing that with a really good support system of mentors, because As much as young people can do things, there's a reason why we have experience as a qualification. So I think having those two really come together in a way that does not hold back young people, but actually enables them to lead, is what I think is key. And understanding that there will be mistakes made, but then a mistake is just an avenue towards another solution. And so this is how I see it in terms of what we need to push forward: facilities or extra issues surrounding young people, conflict, and such like things. And I think that there are multiple ways we can tackle this, but primarily I think youth need to be taken seriously, and they need to be given a platform, and beyond a platform, they need to be supported financially in a way that they can push their ideas, whether that's social projects, companies, what have you, to really take it forward.
Perfect. Thanks, Jesse and Hayley. And as I think I really relate to the sense of trust and belief in young people rather than a tokenistic relationship that we take when actually understanding how intergenerational relationships can work to unlock solutions. And when it comes to climate change, we know that younger activists are often at the forefront of the climate debate, with voices such as those of Leah Namigurwa and Anuna Diweaver. And youth-led organisations are among the most visible in global conversations advocating climate action. And actually, according to a recent Pew Research Centre survey of Americans compared with older generations, Gen Zers and millennials are taking more about the need of action on climate change among social media users. They're seeing more climate change content online, and they're doing more to get involved with the issues through activities such as volunteering and attending rallies and protests. And Bisher, I'd really love to ask you, in your opinion, why are young people more engaged in climate action than older people? And how can leaders leverage young people's passion and enthusiasm to actually make real change?
Hey, thank you very much, Toby, for this question. And let me think about it. If one looks at the definition, one of the definitions, of course, of sustainability, and one of the definitions that I really like is sustainability is the equity of future generation. And it is then becomes very, very clear why the youth are more engaged than my generation, for example, on the issues of climate change, particularly now. There are multiple dimensions to this issue. First of all, the issue of equity, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it is their future, it is their earth, it is their climate, it is their, and in fact, it is ours. But from the point of view of youth, I believe, and I hope that the colleagues here, the expert on the youth side will confirm that they know that it is going to be theirs at some point in time. And that means that it is theirs now. So that means that they have more at stake, and therefore they are aware of this. Now, this is number one. The other dimension is the dimension of knowledge. Okay, knowledge is becoming more available. Youth are becoming much more engaged in generating, in producing knowledge, in demonstrating that they are expert and they can be expert, and in showing everyone that activism is not just merely the issuing of slogans or the issuing of let's coordinate an activity here and coordinate activities here. Activism is rooted in knowledge. You know something, you know that this is going to have a bad impact, then you start taking action in order to prevent that. A third dimension is, I believe, the capacity of the youth for collective work, which I'm not sure that once people are a little older, they start getting settled down, they start getting in, and I'm not talking just in the family side, but in general at the profession, at work, and all of that. So this is the dimension, the ability of the youth to do more collective work. In fact, I believe we can even think about that for answering other questions in terms of how can the youth mobilize the other generation, as opposed to the other question around how can the older generation mobilize the youth. So the collective ability of the youth is very important in making them more active, more engaged, and they are more open to sharing their experience, to discussing their experience, to reading, to accepting other points of view at the moment of time. So I think these are some of the factors that I believe have affected the youth ability. And if I may just say that, in fact, we at UNESCO understand that. and have been working and trying to work with the youth in order to capitalize on these issues with the youth, not to say, oh, okay, just opportunity for the youth, but also for us to learn from the youth and to work with them jointly on addressing some of the critical challenges that faces us. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. I love that reverse, multi-sectional engagement that you think we need to take, where, leaders need to be able to enable young people to be able to make real change, but also young people need to allow leaders to contribute in their own way as well. And something I like to say often is that as a young person, I'm 20 years old. I've lived every day, at the face of climate change and wear these imaginary goggles in seeing the problem differently. And I think young people do see that.
Yes.
That's incredibly important to recognize, and how we have conversations together. But something else that's incredibly important to recognize is that we know that 90% of the world's young people actually live in developing countries, and their voices need to be part of the discussion on how we tackle climate change more as well. So I'd love to jump over to Aisha and Jessie again and ask the question of what are the barriers that prevent a more diverse range of young voices, racially and geographically, from being heard in these conversations?
Thank you, Toby. From my personal experience in developing countries, they do think we have a lot of high awareness on climate change, but even though we have an idea of what it is, we actually don't know that much about it. And even the ones that have a high level of awareness on climate change, only a few have the opportunity to raise their voices to fight against climate change. Even though we know a lot about climate change, we cannot connect it to our real lives. In my island also, we're currently having the monsoon season. It's really rough, but no one would say it's because of climate change. We do not connect the unpredictable weather. We do not connect what we see in our day-to-day lives. I think the lack of awareness is a huge barrier for us to raise our voices, and the lack of opportunities and places like summits and conferences where we can be part of these discussions.
And Jessie, do you have any further comments on how, what those barriers are that are preventing a more diverse conversation from people in racially and geographically diverse regions of the world?
Yeah, I'd love to echo what Aisha said in terms of just awareness. And I think this is driven mostly because the ability to focus on climate change, I would say, is a privilege for a lot of people, just because I'll give an example directly. So this is an electric motorcycle. And if I was selling this motorcycle in Europe, one of the biggest selling points would be it is clean and it's good for the environment. But the biggest selling point in my country is it saves money and it is cheaper to operate. The fundamental decision-making around lifestyle, which ultimately affects climate, is based very importantly on your economic background. And I think for a lot of people, it's just not real because there's just so much else to focus on. Then why am I focused on CO2 emissions? It's not really affecting. And so I think that's one particular area. But of the Africans that are privileged to speak on such issues, I think their voices need to be amplified a little bit more because the contextual knowledge of where they come from cannot be studied effectively as someone who lives there and understands the space in which they occupy. Aisha was talking about monsoons. I have no idea about monsoons. I'll listen to her. And it's one of these things where experts come in and they disregard local voices and local thoughts and ideas instead of incorporating that into research. And I see that as an issue. COP27 is coming up, and I think people like Aisha should have a platform to speak to leaders and say, hey, this is an issue. And I think there are various also platforms we can play in activism, as well as product. So one thing I always say is one of the biggest ways to catalyze meaningful change is to make it practical to someone on their day-to-day lives. You'll see this with cooking stoves, right? People initially, cooking stoves pollute an incredible amount of CO2, and they're all over the continent. But what is a way we can make it cheaper, but then have an effect on the environment that's positive in a way that then people adopt this, because this is what's going to happen for, meaningful change. Because I think that should be the outcome of activism, beyond just creating policies. Should create a practical method to then implement solutions at a personal level, at a national level, and at a continental level.
Thanks, Jesse. I really loved your comment of contextual understanding of where somebody lives cannot be studied. That's a really strong message to take home today. And now if we just take a bit of a reflection back to 2008 on International Youth Day, Ban Ki-moon was then the Secretary General of the United Nations and said that youth should be given a chance to take an active part in the decision-making of local, national, and global levels, and they can actively support initiatives that will lead to the passage of far-reaching legislation. Now, that was 14 years ago today. Since then, we have seen countries like the UAE appoint the world's youngest minister, and excuse my pronunciation, Sharma bint Suhail Fariz al-Mazri, Minister for Youth Affairs, who was 22 when she was appointed in 2016, which is incredible. But Andreas, I'd really love to know, do you think enough young people have been given a chance to become more active in decision-making?
Well, first, I'd like to salute Jesse for what you just said before, and for all the audience and visitors here. Jesse is one of the prize winners of the Sheikh Zayed Great Sustainability Prize. So, Jesse, well done. I'd love to support people, and I love to support the youth. And Jesse, you're a great ambassador of that prize, because I think you should answer that question on how we can include the next generation. I can answer this for the Western world, the Northern Hemisphere, and maybe you should answer that for the Southern Hemisphere, because that's the place where the world is going to be, where the key decisions will be made in the next 30 years. And for the Western world, the Northern Hemisphere, I can only, and I care most about the Southern Hemisphere. My passion for Africa, and you will hear this if you like to later, is immense. For the Western world, I can only say these companies are trying hard, and it's only symbolic. It's not good enough. We have to do much more interdepartmental rotation. We have to do much more job rotation. We have to do, and what I'm trying to do in our business, and we're selling chocolate, and sometimes I have a cup of Jacobs coffee, but we're trying hard to do projects where we integrate young generations, the younger, give them a chance to lead projects. We drive cross-department responsibility in the company. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is not going to change the world. This is maybe changing business environment. And I think the strength of the young generation comes through digitalization, to the ability to participate. We train them, and that moves the young generation in. But maybe to Jesse, or to some of you, talking about, this is the Western world view, talking about, and that's the key thing. The key question to me is how to integrate the young generations in the growing places of this world, and especially Africa.
Yeah, thanks, Andreas. And I think, when we think about climate change and the global north and the global south, we think about the issues and young people like Jesse and Aisha, who are incredible leaders. It's that, as someone, I live in Australia and the global north country, and I try every single day to remind myself that the impacts of the climate crisis are felt first and worst by people in the global south, and remind myself that the solutions to this big issue lie within those people. But it's such a hard thing to contextualize, and we've just had an amazing, contribution from both Aisha and Jesse. But another perspective is, how much work do we still have to get done to make sure that young people across the planet equitably still have a seat at the decision-making table. I'd love to ask Bisher if you had any opinions on that one.
Well, let me just go back to what Aisha and what Jesse said. Aisha made a very important point, which said we cannot connect, the climate, the global climate change to our daily, everyday activities, and this particular storm is connected. And then just you also brought up the issue of economic issue. And if you look at both issues, I want to go back a little bit in time to 1969. And if you go to 1969, the world was awed with the fact that the first human landed on the moon. And notwithstanding the political issues that were kind of motivating the space race at that point in time, but that same year, in fact, was the first year we started understanding climate change. It was the first time what we call a three-dimensional model of the Earth that had one continent, one sea, a very simplified model, was introduced by a young Japanese-American scientist, Manabe. And that paper that was published that year has become the foundation for what we know about climate change today. And if you go back to that particular paper then, and you see what the paper said, and of course, a few following papers within the next few years, Manabe is a 90-some years old, but at that point in time, he was in his 30s. So he was a young scholar. And if you look at what the finding of that paper, in fact, that finding of that paper say almost along the general line what we are talking about today, but with more details. Now we have been for 50 years now, and I'm saying as part of the community that has at some point in time worked a lot on climate change science, its impact on water resources. For 50 years, we have been trying to make the connection that Aisha has asked about. Okay, so these are connections. Now, if we say so, from my point of view, at the global level, from the policy-making level, in fact, we have lost a tremendous opportunity because we had 50 years while we are trying to get at the detail where we didn't see the maze or the decision makers, the global decision-making community didn't see that there is a need for radical action and major action until we got in 2015, that was the climate change accord in Paris. Now, can we learn from those lessons? Okay, we of course, many at that point in time, which is very common in science, is that you debate the paper, you debate the concept, but for very few years after that, the concept was established. We know climate change is happening. We know what the main causes of climate change and everything. So I would say by the middle 70s or early 80s, it was a fact. And it was a fact that brought by the younger generation at that point in time. Alas, that particular generation was not as active as today's generation in making that point, did not have the same level of ability and the same tools and technology that now our today's generation have. So that gives them that ability to learn more, to become more active, and to learn more. So to go back is, yes, we still have to do a lot. We have to do exactly what Aisha asked for. Make sure that the younger generation voice is heard at major conferences and major issues. We have to make sure that research output from young generation at UNESCO, for example, we have an example called Youth as Researchers, program. And that particular program highlights, young researchers and try to bring them together into discussion and dialogue with policymakers. But let me put it this way. It's a program that as an international organization, we're trying to spread out, but it is not enough. We need more of that. We need to make sure, all of us, that companies, and let's go back to banks. Banks need to be able to start thinking, if I have a young, innovative team that has some good ideas, I need to take some risk and some financial risk, because they have taken so much financial risk with housing issues in the world for years. And now let's take financial risk because it will pay. When you invest in the younger generation, innovative approaches, and when you invest in the younger generation. We come back to the government. Many governments, especially in developing countries, we need to establish a mechanism some institutional framework that brings in the voice of the youth into the policymaking. Of course, I mean, there has been so many things that we've done to bring more inclusiveness at the national level, whether it's more inclusive of women, whether it's more inclusive of what we call marginalized communities. We need to find some tools also, or the same approach to bring in the youth into the policy making, maybe provide a quota in parliament, maybe some sort of an approach that brings in the voice of the youth into the highest level of decision making. Thank you very much for the question.
Thanks.
Bisher, can I jump in, because I like this
Please
to
go
be
ahead.
very
Please go ahead,
interactive. As you know, my family, we're running and owning the largest chocolate and cocoa business in the world, and I'm still shocked, because when I look at West Africa, where most of the cocoa beans come from, we still have over 500,000 of families in Ghana and Ivory Coast living in poverty. Means that we still have and poverty below the UN level of 190. Still means we have over 20,000 cases of child misuse, child labor every year. This is shocking, and we have to start there. I mean, I don't like to put oil into wine here, but we have to address that. What do you think about this around the table here?
I think endemically, especially we're talking about the continent, it's almost seemingly unfair that, you know, we speak about climate and climate activism, and, you know, gotta do research, etc. And you know, the Western world had centuries to use fossil fuels and grow their industries to a point where then there's exploitation of African resources. And, you know, it's kind of a little bit high and mighty to say, you know, Africans then need to adapt once we're finding natural gas reserves in Mozambique or etc. And so, you know, the onus should not be on us to change. The onus should then be on the West to drop, because it's 3%. And then from a ownership perspective, we hit this into a podcast. Savings and credits corporations are really effective on the continent. So this is where a group of people come together, and then they set up a group where they lend each other money. And there are lots of startups and initiatives that are formalizing those institutions or making them institutionalized. Because what's a big issue why maybe the cocoa farmers are not able to break out of poverty after so many years? Can they own, can refining chocolate, I don't know if that's the correct term, happen in Ghana and then export happen across? Or can the coffee growers in Kenya own a roastery in Hamburg where coffee is just so much more expensive? There's just a fact that raw materials are sold at 100x the price as a finished good. And that's just happened for years, and that's not been addressed. And I think, you know, we could point at the government, point at company, but there's a collective responsibility on that one. If we can't even get that right, it's really putting the horse before the carriage to then say, these guys should care about climate change. This guy should, you know, care about reducing their emissions or adapting to change. No, this just doesn't make sense, and that's why it's not going to work. And regardless of how many papers and conversations, because you said there have been 27 COPs, that's a problem, right? They should not have been 27 COPs. And the way we change that is just putting more money in people's pockets and letting people really craft their own future, but really look at what responsibility is and say, look, you know, there's still so much that's going on. Why should we then be forced to change the methods of industrialization, which will ideally give people more jobs, which will then complete the loop, right? So I think that there lies the crux of the matter.
But thanks for that input and that conversation as well, Andreas, especially starting that. I think something that is often misunderstood or not valued much is education, and how do we educate people on everything that's not just climate change, but corporate responsibility, individual responsibility, cross-sector responsibility. So when we're talking about how do we solve climate change, or what are the impacts of climate change? It's not directly environmental. Sometimes it's social, sometimes it's about consuming, sometimes it's about energy. And how do we educate that? And the final big question that I would love to ask Hayley and Aisha is that young people are incredibly engaged and passionate about climate change. And following on from that conversation and my talking points just there, we know that there's still a great need for involvement from young people in the education space. And youth education represents one of the most effective tools to combat the destructive potential of climate change and cultivate global awareness among members of the next generation. So what do you think the major obstacles to getting more youth educated about the world and about climate change is, and how do you think that we can overcome that?
So I suppose this flows on quite well from what Jessie was saying, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is purely just that education has been across the world inequitable, whether that's in Australia within our very structured system that we have, in other countries where especially young women are unable to access education because of gender norms. There's other areas young people can't access education because they have to provide for their families. They purely don't have an option. There's no education systems within their areas. There are so many factors that prohibit education, whether it's electricity access. There's just so many different things. I think in the Ukraine alone this year, it was about 7.5 million children have had their education interrupted due to the ongoing crises. So we're seeing education impacted greatly across the world. And I think to overcome this, we really need to think outside the box of how we can ensure that young people have the skills they need to be able to both mitigate, but most importantly, unfortunately, adapt to the impacts of climate change. And it's something that we've been working on a lot at the Global Centre on Adaptation, is really looking at how to effectively work with young people to develop tangible skills and education and knowledge of both local adaptation in all sorts of areas of their lives, and really understanding, kind of as Aisha was saying before, linking the experiences that they're having in their day-to-day life with the changes of the climate and really overcoming that knowledge gap as well. And I think that's a really important kind of place to start. But I think also really understanding that education comes in different ways. It's not just your standard teacher and student aspect. There's so many different ways of learning through things like traditional ecological knowledge, learning from people that have generations of understanding, and really diving deep and understanding the intersectional nature of climate change and the need to really have a just focus when we're looking at both mitigation and adaptation. And like Jessie has put so well, it's such an important aspect. I truly don't believe we can even begin to solve or overcome some of the problems that we're facing without having that lens. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well, Aisha.
I really connect with what Hayley said about that we need to learn in different ways other than standard teachers. It is something I would also love to see. But from my personal experience, the biggest obstacle in getting more youth educated is how we were educated about climate change at first. Even from my personal experience, if I look back at what I was first taught about climate change, to my mind instantly, it would come polar bears and polar regions. I would not be able to think of my island or how it would affect me as an individual or how it would affect my community. And I think that makes it seem like a thing of the future for the youth of today. So we need to change how that is being educated, because if we continue to educate them using pictures of faraway places and stories from afar instead of close, they won't be able to personally relate to it, and they will not understand the urgency for action to be taken. And we would not know why we are studying about climate change, why we need to be educated.
Thanks, Hayley and Aisha. There's some really great comments there. And I think we should not really underestimate the power that a classroom has, really, because I think sometimes we take that for granted.
If I may, Toby, it's not just the classroom. we need to think of education more as a wider aspect. And this is, in fact, what we've been trying to do in UNESCO for years now. Formal education, informal education, workshops, engagement in conferences, engagement in any forum where information is being exchanged, and the more it is related at the local level, the better. Now, let me back off and try to also, again, I really appreciate Aisha's comment about how do we link climate change, what's happening on climate change at the local level. And I think this is exactly where we need to engage the youth as researchers, as experts at the local scale. To start, first of all, you need to go back and talk to the older generation to say, how was it 50 years ago? How was it 20 years ago? Did you see as much storm? Did you see, I'm not gonna go too much into the detail of what kind of social, scientific, and all of technical studies that you need to do, but if not engaging the youth at the local level in finding the fact, in becoming the investigators themselves, it's not going to be as easy to link, because most of these climate change studies are done in mega centers where you really have supercomputers, you have a lot of budget put into that research in order to come up with those details and by the way, that itself also consumes energy, but not as Bitcoin or at other type of economic activities that take, but it does. I mean, you have a lot of effort is being done to understand at the global scale, trying to do it at the local scale, but you need to get those information, that data about what is happening at the local scale in more detail in order to not just see the impact on whether there will be more monsoon storms or it's going to be more severe, but the actual impact of these events on the daily life of people, on the social economic aspect of issues, on is it going to make it harder for us to eradicate poverty, which I thank Andreas for bringing it as a major challenge, not only to addressing climate change, but to activism itself. And sorry for the interruption, but I felt that I need to highlight that education is multifaceted, it's across the board.
Yeah, no apologies for interrupting, Bisher. It's a conversation. I think something that Hayley mentioned is taking it outside the box is really applied.
Yes, I fully agree with that.
Taking it outside the box. Andreas, question for you. We've been speaking about education. We've been speaking about the importance of that and thinking outside the box and how do we apply that to ensure that we can overcome barriers. And a direct link to that is capacity development. So how do we actually build capacity within young and emerging leaders and empower them to take action on climate change? What opportunities exist currently for upskilling young people?
Well, thank you, Toby. As I mentioned earlier, Western companies try to establish organizations that are not just hierarchical, but they also allow projects with young leaders to be the key sustainability, the key strategic projects in a company. But let me maybe move on and say it's not about the Western world and how we in the Western world organize, try to integrate the younger generation to actually attract and retain younger generations. Overall in the world, I think it's all about allowing young generations to learn, to participate, to access, to enlarge, to enrich. Personally, I believe in the Western world, we call it ESG, and we should maybe in the developing world call it SEG, because I believe the social element is the condition for the environmental element, meaning that the social economic conditions have to be improved, and the Western world have to understand that we have to improve this before we can actually implement a more better economic environment. I know this is not the answer to your question, but I believe we should maybe focus on this and enforce and push. And I'm happy to hear Bisher's answer and Jesse's answer to this, but we have to enforce a more SEG-driven agenda for the world to educate and to socially include before we force the developing countries to become ecologically a better environment.
But absolutely, it just goes without saying, if you visit the continent, you need to have social aspects really leading. And one, Aisha saying linking it to the local level, for me, the biggest place to start is where do people get their food? And how can we relate jobs that are beneficial, green jobs, etc., to how people earn? One of the biggest reasons why people pollute and do things is because it's a quick way to make money. And so I think reorganizing the financial incentives around climate is what's going to happen at a local level. So in practical aspects, maybe that's saying, hey, we will give you X for how much you give back in terms of pollution, or we will train you to then do X, Y, and Z in terms of this particular area. The real critical mix is not too crazy to understand. If the economics work for a lot of people, then you will see a big awareness in terms of whether people care about climate or not. And so this is the place where I think everyone kind of says, oh, no, you need to do research, you need to do X, and kind of like hides away from the fact that we need to get people sustainably earning more money and feeding the families, period. And that's a lot of different ways we can do that. That's government incentives, whether that's better agricultural practices, upskilling people in that regard, whether that's better distribution. But that's where we need to start. So normal conversations and talking, and we can sit here. I think there needs to be a concerted effort to say, and so there's been a lot of focus on smallholder farmers. There's been a lot of focus on all these things. So I think these are kind of the areas where I would say, so to agree with Andreas, yes, socially, let's do it. And let's also couple that with really good incentives for individuals who live below the poverty line to make money in line with green incentives.
Thanks, Jesse. And we are running out of time, and we wish, when we're in these conversations, we wish that time was never a constraint, but everywhere has a time constraint, unfortunately. So there's just two real quick questions that I want to ask before we close off in the next few minutes. The last one for Hayley. How would you advise a young person to step out of your comfort zone and get involved in the energy transition?
Yeah, certainly. So I think this one is another one when we talk about thinking outside the box. So in my experience working with young people, this seems to be one of the areas where people kind of step back a little bit because they think they don't have the technical knowledge or the skills to really step up and take a place in this transition. And I think something that's really important here is to understand that there are so many different ways that young people can get involved. Jesse, you're an excellent example. But there's just so many other ways. Like, think about community solar grids. You can think about ways of lobbying to decision makers about clean energy. Think about renewable projects, where they're happening, how they're happening, and what sources you can leverage within your communities and within your wider countries as well. I know in Australia, we have some really good renewable energy pushes coming through, especially for small scale renewables as well. So there's definitely lots of opportunities out there, at least for those of us lucky enough to have those incentives. I will note that there's definitely a privileged position in that as well. But for people who don't, I think it's really important to think about the fact that there is this energy transition, but like Jesse has mentioned, there are some people who are simply just struggling to survive. So we really need to address this, like I mentioned before, in an intersectional way, where we're really thinking about equity here, and putting that at the center of the work in this. We're not leaving people behind, and we're bringing people together on a journey.
Great way to answer that question, Hayley. And I think especially, looking at the social impacts of climate change and also the social opportunities that we have when solving climate change, it's so important. Now, I have one last question for you all, and it's probably the hardest question of the whole day. In one word, how would you each describe the future of sustainability? Bisher, we'll start with you. One word.
Uncertain. Uncertain.
Perfect. Hayley?
Equitable.
equitable. Andreas?
2 words: fix poverty.
Aisha?
Innovative.
And if it was me answering that question, I'd say opportunity, because sometimes it might seem like it's the biggest challenge the world has, but for me, it's our biggest opportunity to do all of these things. So thank you all so much for joining in for today's conversation, and to our incredible guest speakers for your valuable insights. I loved being part of today's session, and these conversations were so important. And I think we're going to learn a lot of that from watching this again later, but also for all our viewers, thank you for joining in. We hope that you are as inspired as what I am, and I'm sure what all our guest speakers are after having this conversation. And if you'd like to watch the entire season, you can do that on the Zayed Sustainability Prize's YouTube channel. Thank you very much.